Soldiers stopped a small party of riders on a road in northern Poitou in the first week of November 1173, close to the French border. Nothing about the group looked unusual at first. A handful of travelers, moving fast, keeping off the main routes. One of the riders sat a horse astride, dressed in a man's clothes, hood up against the cold. When the soldiers pulled that hood back, they were looking at a woman of about 50, the Queen of England, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, mother of the heir to the throne. She was arrested on the spot, on the orders of her own husband, for the crime of raising their sons in open war against him. Gervase of Canterbury, a monk writing not long after, is the one who preserved the detail about the men's clothing, and he clearly found it shocking. A queen in breeches, riding like a soldier, running for the protection of her first husband to escape her second. Henry II locked her away for the next 16 years. She came out of that captivity at around 65 years old and proceeded to run 2 kingdoms, ransom a king, cross the Pyrenees in winter, survive a siege by her own teenage grandson, and bury nearly everyone she had ever loved. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. In her own lifetime, chroniclers called her an adulteress. They called her incestuous. Churchmen wrote letters ordering her to submit to her husband, and monks whispered that her whole family was descended from the devil. Centuries of ballads accused her of murdering her husband's mistress with a dagger in one hand and a bowl of poison in the other. The title of this video calls her the most ruthless woman of the Middle Ages, and by the end of it you can decide for yourself whether that word belongs to her, or to the men around her, or to the century she survived. Fair warning though, very little of what follows is gentle. This is a story with a burned church full of people in it, a skull delivered in a silver box, a king dying on a bed of ashes with a rope around his neck, a man flayed alive, and a teenage boy at the bottom of the Seine with a stone tied to his body. Eleanor walked through all of it and lived to about 80. Before we head south to where it all starts, welcome in. If you're new here, this is where we sit down with the stranger corners of history and take our time with them. And if you're a regular, good to have you back. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from, whether that's a commute, a night shift, or 3 in the morning with the lights off. I genuinely enjoy seeing how far these travel. A big thank you, as always, to the patrons and the YouTube members who keep this channel running. You make these long ones possible. If you'd like to support the channel, the links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, get comfortable. We're going to Aquitaine. The duchy Eleanor was born into stretched from the River Loire in the north down to the Pyrenees Mountains on the Spanish border, and from the Atlantic coast inland toward the mountains of the Auvergne. On a map, it dwarfed the lands the King of France actually controlled, and in wealth the comparison was almost embarrassing. Bordeaux shipped wine, the coast produced salt. The Poitou countryside was thick with vineyards, wheat, and some of the most quarrelsome barons in Europe. The Dukes of Aquitaine held their court at Poitiers in a palace with a great hall that still stands today, and in that hall people sang. That detail matters more than it sounds. The South spoke Occitan rather than French, and it was the birthplace of the troubadours, the poets who more or less invented the European love song. Eleanor grew up in a world where music, poetry, and open scandal sat side by side at the dinner table. Her grandfather made sure of the scandal part personally. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, is remembered as the very first troubadour, the earliest poet in a European vernacular language whose work survives with his name attached. Some of his songs are courtly and delicate. Others are so obscene that Victorian translators simply refuse to finish them. One of his poems cheerfully describes pretending to be a mute so that two noble women would feel safe taking him to bed, and includes his own tally of how the week went. This was Eleanor's grandfather, and his private life matched the songs. He was excommunicated twice. The first time when a bald bishop stood ready to pronounce the sentence against him, William drew his sword and told the man to absolve him or die. The bishop calmly stretched out his neck and told him to strike. William put the sword away, saying he didn't love the bishop enough to send him to paradise. The second excommunication came over a woman. Her name was Dangereuse, or Dangerosa in the local tongue, and she was the wife of William's own vassal, the Viscount of Châtellerault. Around 1115, the Duke took her from her husband, whether by abduction or elopement depends on who you ask, and installed her in a newly built tower of his palace at Poitiers called the Maubert Jaune. People took to calling her La Maubert Jaune after it. William's lawful wife, Philippa of Toulouse, had given him 7 children and had governed his lands while he was away on crusade, and she came home to find another man's wife living in her palace. She withdrew, humiliated, to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a religious house on the border of Anjou. Fontevraud opens this family's story, and it will close it. A papal legate arrived to demand that William give Dangereuse up. The legate happened to be bald as an egg, and William looked at him and said that curls would grow on the man's head before he parted with the Viscountess. He is also said to have had her portrait painted on his shield, announcing that he wanted to bear her in battle as she had borne him in bed. He said that out loud, at his own court, about the wife of one of his own barons. Excommunication meant nothing to him. He kept her until he died. Now here is where the family tree folds in on itself. Dangereuse had children by her lawful husband, including a daughter named Eleanor. The old duke had a son and heir by Philippa, the future William X. Dangereuse arranged for her daughter to marry her lover's son. The marriage went ahead around 1121, and out of it came Eleanor. Put plainly, Eleanor's paternal grandfather was the longtime lover of her maternal grandmother, and that she was raised in a palace where the living monument to that affair, the Maubert Jaune Tower, stood over the courtyard. Her very name may carry the echo. One tradition holds that Eleanor comes from the Latin alia Aenor, the other Aenor, the daughter named after and set apart from her mother. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most famous holy man of the age, would later say of this brood that they came from the devil and would return to the devil, and the remarkable thing is that the family repeated the line themselves, almost proudly. She was born around 1122, possibly as late as 1124, either at Poitiers or at the Château of Belin near Bordeaux. The records of her childhood are thin, and honestly that's normal. Nobody bothers writing down the daily life of a little girl, even a duke's daughter, until she matters politically. What we can say is that she was educated well beyond the standard of the age. She learned to speak Latin as well as her native Occitan and the French of the north. She was taught music, literature, embroidery, household management, and she learned to ride, hunt, and hawk, which she loved her entire life. She grew up hearing her grandfather's songs performed in her grandfather's hall. 2 deaths broke into that childhood early. Around 1130, when Eleanor was perhaps 6 or 8, her mother Eleanor died, and in the same short span her little brother died as well. His name was William Egret, and he was about 4 years old. In one blow, the family lost its duchess and its male heir, and nobody recorded what killed them. A fever, most likely, the same anonymous sicknesses that emptied cradles across Europe every year. From that point on, the duchy's future rested on two small girls, Eleanor and her younger sister Petronilla, and their father does not seem to have hurried into remarriage to produce a replacement son. Whether that was grief or negligence, it turned Eleanor into one of the most dangerous things a girl could be in the 12th century, an heiress. Her father, William X, was a large, loud, warlike man who fought his own vassals, fought his neighbours, and for several years backed the wrong pope in a church schism, a decision that brought him face to face with Bernard of Clairvaux himself. The story goes that Bernard confronted the Duke at Mass, advancing on him with the consecrated host in his hands, and daring him to defy God to his face, and that William, this armoured slab of a man, collapsed. Witnesses describe him foaming, rigid, apparently having some sort of seizure in front of the entire congregation before submitting completely. Whatever actually happened in that church, it worked on him. Within a couple of years, the Duke had turned penitent, and in the spring of 1137, he set out on the great pilgrimage of the age, the road to the shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. Before he left, he placed his daughters under the protection of the Archbishop of Bordeaux. He was 38 years old, healthy, and expected back within months. The pilgrim road did its work on thousands of travellers every year, and it killed a fair number of them. Bad water, spoiled food, exhaustion, fevers picked up in crowded hostels. On Good Friday, the 9th of April 1137, within sight of the end of his journey, Duke William X was suddenly taken violently ill. Later writers blamed tainted water or bad food eaten along the way, and the speed of it suggests something like acute food poisoning or dysentery hitting a body already worn down by weeks of hard travel. He was dying by the evening. On his deathbed, still on foreign soil, he dictated his final wishes. His duchy, the richest inheritance in Western Europe, passed to a girl of about 13. And knowing exactly what that meant, he begged that King Louis VI of France take her under his guardianship and find her a suitable husband. He died that same Good Friday, and was buried at the Cathedral of Santiago itself, at the feet of St. James, about as far from home as a Duke of Aquitaine could be laid. Word travelled north as fast as a rider could carry it, and it travelled in secret. Everyone involved understood the danger. A 13-year-old girl now held Aquitaine, Poitou, and Gascony, and in the 12th century an unmarried heiress was, bluntly, something to be taken. The mechanics were ugly and simple. A lord with enough armed men could seize an heiress on the road, carry her to a chapel, force a marriage and consummate it, and once that was done, the thing tended to stand. The church might object, her kin might object, but possession of her body meant possession of her lands, and plenty of families in this story built their fortunes exactly that way. Eleanor's own grandfather had taken another man's wife by force of personality and men-at-arms and kept her for life. Every ambitious baron between Bordeaux and Paris understood that whoever got to this girl first got a third of France. King Louis VI understood it too. He was called Louis the Fat, and by 1137 the nickname had turned cruel. He was so heavy he could no longer mount a horse. He was dying of dysentery in the summer heat, and he received the news of William's death while lying sick at a hunting lodge, sweating through what everyone around him recognized as his final illness. But his mind was still sharp, and he moved with astonishing speed. Within days he had arranged to marry Eleanor to his own son and heir, the 16-year-old Louis, and he sent the boy south with an escort variously reported at 500 knights, along with senior councillors to make sure nothing went wrong. Speed was everything. Every day Eleanor sat unmarried in Bordeaux was a day someone might get over the walls to her. The wedding took place on the 25th of July, 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux. She was around 13, maybe 15. He was 16 or 17. They were crowned Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine that same day, and then the wedding party started the hot, tense journey north through her lands, where at least some of her barons made their feelings known. At Poitiers, the couple were still celebrating when a messenger arrived with news from Paris. Louis the Fat had died on the 1st of August. The dysentery had finished him. The boy in the wedding clothes was now King Louis VII, and Eleanor, a few weeks past her father's memorial masses, was Queen of France. She had been an orphan, a bride, a duchess, and a queen inside 4 months. Paris must have been a shock to her system. She came from a sunlit court of poets and left it for a cramped royal palace on the Île de la Cité, the little island in the middle of the Seine, damp, cold, and by her standards provincial. She reportedly set about renovating her quarters and importing some southern comfort, and northern churchmen sniffed at her tapestries, her ladies, her music, and her opinions. The real problem, though, was her husband. Louis VII had never been meant for the throne. He was a second son, raised from childhood at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and pointed toward a life in the church, and he had the temperament for it, mild, scrupulous, devout to the point of self-punishment. He fasted, he prayed constantly, he dressed simply and kept his bed simple too. He was king at all only through one of the blackest little accidents of the century. In 1131, his older brother Philip, the crown prince, was riding through a Paris street when a pig, one of the thousands of pigs that roamed the city eating garbage, ran between his horse's legs. The horse went down, the prince went into the road head first, and he died of his injuries the next day. Parisians called the animal the devil's pig. A running pig in a filthy street, and the whole direction of French history changed, and a monkish boy was pulled out of the cloister and given a crown he never wanted, and eventually a wife he could not begin to understand. To be fair to Louis, he adored her. Chroniclers agree on that. He loved her with an intensity his advisers found unseemly, and for the first years of the marriage she could steer him. A remark attributed to Eleanor much later, filtered through minstrels, sums up her side of the arrangement. She thought she had married a king and found she had married a monk. He came to her bed rarely and guiltily. Meanwhile, she was expected to produce an heir, and year after year nothing came, and at a medieval court everyone counted the years and everyone assigned the blame to the wife. The first real catastrophe of her queenship grew out of a family scandal, and the trail of it runs straight through her. Her little sister Petronilla, in her mid-teens, began an affair with Raoul of Vermandois, the Seneschal of France, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Raoul was in his 40s, a seasoned soldier with one eye, and he was very much married to a kinswoman of Count Theobald of Champagne, one of the great princes of France. None of that stopped anyone. Around 1142, with the young king's blessing, 3 obliging bishops declared Raoul's marriage invalid so he could marry Petronilla, and his first wife was sent home to her family in disgrace. Contemporaries had no doubt where the pressure on Louis came from. His teenage queen wanted her sister made respectable, and the king could refuse her nothing. Count Theobald exploded, as anyone might when their kinswoman is discarded like a worn cloak. He appealed to the Pope, and the Pope came down hard. Raoul and Petronilla were excommunicated. The bishops who had performed the ceremony were suspended, and Louis, already tangled in a separate, poisonous dispute with the papacy over who should be Archbishop of Bourges, a quarrel that had gotten Louis himself placed under sanction, took the whole thing as a challenge to his crown. In 1142 he invaded Champagne. The armies of the most Christian king marched into Theobald's lands, burning as they went, and in January of 1143 they came to a prosperous little walled town called Vitry. What happened at Vitry followed him for the rest of his life. The royal army stormed the town, and as the soldiers came over the defences, the fighting turned into a sack. Fire started or was set. The townspeople, ordinary tradesmen, farm wives, children, the old, did what people always did when a town fell. They ran for the church, the one stone and timber building with thick walls and the protection of God over its door. Hundreds and hundreds of them packed inside, shoulder to shoulder in the dark, listening to the killing outside, and then the fire reached the church. The roof timbers caught. Depending on which account you follow, 1,300 people were inside, or as many as 1,500. The burning roof came down on all of them. Every soul in the building died in the flames, and the accounts say Louis watched it happen from rising ground outside the walls, close enough to hear it. He is described as being unable to speak for days afterward. The town itself carried the scar in its name. For generations afterward, people called the place Vitry le Brûlé, Vitry the Burned. A 19th century French scholar went back through the sources and argued that the enormous casualty figures had swollen in the telling, the way medieval numbers often do, and that popular retelling had done some of the work. Maybe so. The chroniclers of the time, though, wrote down over 1,000 dead. They wrote down the church, and they wrote down the king's horror. And it was the king's horror that changed history. Louis pulled back from the war. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote him letters that sound like a man grabbing a sinner by the collar, telling the king he was behaving like a boy and piling up the dead. Peace came slowly, and the burden of Vitry settled onto Louis's conscience and stayed there. And through all of it, the whisper attached itself to Eleanor. Her sister's bed had started the war. Her influence had pushed the king into it. However much of that is fair, that is how her enemies told it, and it was the first stone in a wall of accusations that would be built around her for the rest of her life. One more scene from these Paris years before everything changes. In 1144, at the glittering dedication of the new Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, Eleanor came face to face with Bernard of Clairvaux, the gaunt, terrifying holy man who had broken her father in a church and scolded her husband over Vitry. Bernard told her, more or less, to stop meddling in the affairs of the kingdom. Her answer is one of the most human moments in her whole record. She didn't argue politics with him. She asked him to pray for her to have a child. 7 years married, still no baby, an entire court murmuring about it. and the proudest woman in France stood in front of a living saint and asked for that. Bernard promised his intercession in exchange for peace and good behavior, and in 1145 Eleanor gave birth. A daughter, Marie, not the son France demanded, but proof, at least, that she could carry a child. The court exhaled briefly. That Christmas, at Bourges, her husband stood up and announced that he intended to take the cross and march to the Holy Land, and the entire story swung east. The Second Crusade had a trigger of its own, far away. In 1144, the county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states carved out in the east, fell to the armies of Zengi, and reports of the massacre that followed reached Europe embroidered with every horror the messengers could carry. Louis, still dreaming of Vitry's burning church, saw a road to absolution. At Easter, 1146, on a hillside at Vézelay in Burgundy, Bernard of Clairvaux preached the crusade to a crowd so large no building could hold it. The response overwhelmed him. The supply of cloth crosses ran out, and Bernard tore strips from his own habit to hand out to the men pressing forward. And in the middle of that frenzy, the Queen of France took the cross herself. Eleanor would go on crusade, in person, with a company of her own ladies and, more to the point, with the vassals of Aquitaine, who would follow their duchess a great deal more willingly than they would follow her husband. A later Greek writer, describing the Western armies, mentioned women riding armed in the Crusader host, sitting their horses like men, and out of that grew the enduring image of Eleanor and her ladies dressed as Amazons, riding bare-legged with plumes in their hair. The picture comes from later tellers rather than anyone who watched the army pass. What the sober sources give us is remarkable enough. A reigning queen in her mid-20s rode 2,500 miles toward a war zone with wagons of her wardrobe behind her, and churchmen were still complaining about the baggage and the women decades later when they needed something to blame. The march east was a slow catastrophe. The French army, tens of thousands of soldiers and pilgrims, walked across Europe to Constantinople through late 1147, wearing out their welcome in every land they crossed. The Emperor Manuel Komnenos received the royal couple with silk and ceremony, gave them a tour of a city bigger than anything in the West, and got them across the water into Asia Minor as fast as he politely could. And in Asia, the news found them. The German crusading army that had gone ahead had been ambushed and effectively annihilated near Dorylaeum. Survivors staggered into the French camp starving and shot through with arrow wounds, and the French kept marching anyway, into an Anatolian winter along coastal tracks with the Turks watching from the hills. Food ran short. Horses died and were eaten. At one camp near Ephesus around Christmas, a flash flood tore through the tents in the night and drowned soldiers and pilgrims in their bedrolls, along with the horses picketed beside them. Men who had taken the cross to save their souls died face down in cold mud 1,000 miles from Jerusalem, and the army was not even in enemy territory yet. Then came Mount Cadmus, early January 1148. The army was crossing a mountain ridge in southwestern Anatolia, strung out along a climbing track with a gorge falling away beside it. The vanguard that day was commanded by Geoffrey de Rancon, Lord of Tylerbourg, one of Eleanor's own Aquitanian vassals, and the Queen and the unarmed pilgrims and the baggage train travelled with that forward division, while Louis commanded the rear. The orders were explicit. The vanguard was to halt on the heights and make camp, so the whole army could concentrate on the summit for the night. Rancon reached the top in early afternoon, looked at the bare, windy ridge, looked at the green valley beyond, and decided, together with the king's uncle, the Count of Savoy, to push on down to better ground. Nobody told the rear half of the army. The column stretched, then tore in two, and into the gap, out of the rocks where they had been waiting, came the Turks. What followed was less a battle than a harvest. The Turkish cavalry hit the disordered middle of the column, where the pack animals and the pilgrims were, on a narrow track with a precipice on one side. Odo of Douai, a monk who was present in the army and wrote it all down, describes horses and men and loaded mules being forced over the edge, tumbling down the rocks into the gorge, riders and animals breaking together on the way down. Men crowded so tightly on the path they could not raise their arms to defend themselves, and the arrows came in sheets. The rear guard fought its way forward piecemeal into the killing ground, and the king's own household knights died around him almost to a man. Louis himself, cut off in the chaos, scrambled up a rock face by grabbing tree roots, and stood there alone in the failing light with his back to the stone, hacking at the men who climbed after him, and Odo says he cut off the heads and hands of several. The Turks didn't realize who they were fighting. In his plain, road-worn cloak, the King of France looked like any other knight worth killing, so eventually they left him for easier prey and went back to stripping the dead. He climbed down after dark and found his way to the vanguard, where they had already given him up. Thousands were dead along that track. Among the named casualties was an earl, William de Warenne of Surrey, and beneath the named men lay all the unnamed ones, the servants, the pilgrims, the women, the priests, left broken in the gorge for the animals. Someone had to answer for it, and the army wanted Geoffrey de Rancon hanged. Louis settled for sending him home in disgrace, sharing the blame officially with the Count of Savoy, whom nobody could hang since he was the king's uncle. And in the tents, quietly, the blame slid one step further. Rancon was the Queen's man. The vanguard was the Queen's contingent. Nobody ever formally accused Eleanor of anything at Cadmus, and no serious source puts the decision in her mouth. But armies gossip like villages, and from this point on the muttering about the Southern Queen and her Southerners never really stopped. It was waiting there, ready, for what happened next. First, the army had to survive reaching the coast, and here the crusade committed one of its ugliest acts against its own people. At the port of Italia, the leaders found they could not hire enough ships for everyone, so the king, the queen, the nobles, and the cavalry took what ships there were, and the mass of the poor pilgrims and infantry were left on the beach with promises of an escort overland. The escort arrangements collapsed almost immediately. The Turks closed in on the abandoned thousands, and between the arrows, starvation and disease, most of those left behind were killed or taken and sold. Some, starving outside the walls of a city that would not feed them, went over to their attackers voluntarily and abandoned the faith they had walked across a continent for. And Odo writes of it with a bitterness you can still feel off the page. These were people who had left their farms because a preacher promised their sins would be washed away. Their crusade ended on a foreign beach, watching the sails of their king get smaller. Louis and Eleanor's ship reached Antioch in March 1148, and at Antioch the whole tone of the story changes, her uncle waiting at the harbour. Raymond of Poitiers, her father's younger brother, was one of the more improbable success stories of the age. He had been a landless younger son, famously tall and handsome, charming in several languages, and he had acquired the Principality of Antioch by sailing east in secret and marrying its heiress Constance when he was in his 30s and she was 9 years old. Almost nobody at the time blinked. That was what happened to little girls who inherited things. By 1148, Raymond ruled a half-Greek, half-Frankish city of gardens and towers, and into it came his niece Eleanor, whom he had known when she was a child at Poitiers. They spoke the same Occitan, sang the same songs, shared the same dead family. He lodged the royal couple in splendor and set about his real business, persuading Louis to use the French army against Aleppo and Nur ad-Din, the rising power that would otherwise strangle Antioch. Strategically, Raymond was right, and nearly every modern assessment agrees the Crusade's best move was the one he proposed. Louis refused. He had sworn to walk to Jerusalem as a pilgrim, and the burned church at Vitry was still burning in his head, and he would not turn aside for anything as worldly as a sound military plan. And Eleanor sided with her uncle, openly, forcefully, in council. The Queen of France backed the Prince of Antioch against her own husband, and the court around Louis started watching how much time she spent in Raymond's company. John of Salisbury, who was at the papal court shortly afterward and heard the story from people directly involved, wrote that the prince's attentions to the Queen and their constant, private conversations aroused the king's suspicion. That is the careful version. William of Tyre, writing a generation later in the East, went much further, stating flatly that Eleanor disregarded her marriage vows and was unfaithful, and dressing the accusation in the extra horror of incest, uncle and niece. What we can nail down is what she did next, and it was explosive enough on its own. When Louis announced they were leaving for Jerusalem, Eleanor announced she was staying in Antioch. And when he pressed her, she raised, apparently for the first time out loud, the question that would eventually end the marriage. She said they were too closely related to be lawfully married at all, cousins within the degrees the church forbade, and that his rights over her were void. She was, in effect, filing for divorce in the middle of a crusade, in her uncle's palace, in front of witnesses. Louis's advisers, in particular a Templar eunuch named Thierry Galleran, whom Eleanor is said to have openly despised and mocked, urged the king to stop treating her as a wife and start treating her as a flight risk. So in the dead of night, the King of France had his own queen seized. Armed men took her from her lodgings, and she was carried out of Antioch by force and put on the road to Jerusalem, effectively a prisoner of her own marriage. She never saw Raymond again. Whatever had or had not happened in those gardens, the manner of her leaving told everyone in the East exactly what her husband believed, and the story ran ahead of them to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Paris, growing as it went. From here on, in the Chronicles, Eleanor is a marked woman. The crusade itself had one last humiliation to deliver. In July 1148, the combined Christian armies marched on Damascus, wealthy, ancient, and until that moment one of the few Muslim powers inclined to get along with the Crusader states. The siege lasted 4 days. The army camped first in the orchards on the west side, where there was water and cover, then let itself be talked into moving to the open eastern side, where there was neither, and when fresh Muslim forces approached, the whole grand enterprise simply turned around and marched away, harassed by mounted archers the entire way home, leaving its dead in the dust behind it. 4 days. Kings and emperors had crossed the known world. Tens of thousands had died on the roads and mountains. The poor had been abandoned on beaches, and the Great Holy War ended in 4 days of bad decisions outside Damascus. Louis hung around the Holy Land for months afterward, keeping Easter in Jerusalem, praying at every shrine while his kingdom ran itself. Eleanor's opinion of all this is not recorded, and by then, the two of them were barely speaking. Word of Raymond's fate reached them before they left the East. In June 1149, Raymond led his army out to face Nur ad-Din at a place called Inab, and got caught in open ground, surrounded, his force cut to pieces around him. He went down fighting, by every account, this enormous golden man swinging until they pulled him from the saddle. Afterward, Nur ad-Din's commander Shirkuh, an uncle of the future Saladin, cut off Raymond's head and his right arm. The head was recognized, and Nur ad-Din had the skull set in a silver case and sent it as a gift to the caliph in Baghdad, proof that the Prince of Antioch was gone. That was the end of the man Eleanor had defied a king for. His widow Constance, the child bride, was in her early 20s with 4 children, and somewhere on the long road home, Eleanor learned that her uncle's skull was a trophy in a silver box 1,000 miles east, and she had a great deal of time on the water to think about it. The voyage home nearly killed her too. The royal couple sailed separately, pointedly, on different ships. Byzantine warships, at war with their Sicilian escorts, attacked the convoy and briefly seized the ship carrying the Queen before Sicilian galleys retook it. Storms scattered the fleet for weeks, long enough that rumors of her death ran around the Mediterranean, and when Eleanor finally staggered ashore in southern Italy, she was so ill she could not travel for some time. Then came one of the strangest nights of her life. On the way north through Italy, in October 1149, the estranged couple stopped at Tusculum to meet Pope Eugenius III, and the annulment question came out into the open. Eugenius would not hear of it. He forbade any further mention of consanguinity, confirmed the marriage as valid on pain of anathema, and then went further than any marriage counsellor before or since. John of Salisbury, who was there at the papal court, records that the Pope had a bed prepared for the King and Queen of France, hung with his own precious fabrics, and personally saw to it that they slept in it together. He talked with them warmly, gave them gifts, and wept when they left. Two people whose marriage had died somewhere between a burned church and an Antioch garden, tucked into a ceremonial bed by the Pope himself, with all Christendom invested in what happened under the covers. Something happened evidently, since in 1150 Eleanor gave birth to her second child, another daughter. They named her Alex. And with that, the marriage was finished in every way except the paperwork. France needed a son. 13 years had produced 2 girls, and Louis's counsellors began telling their grieving, guilt-ridden king what he already knew. God did not bless this marriage. Even Bernard of Clairvaux, no friend of Eleanor's, had been arguing the marriage was invalid for years. The consanguinity argument Eleanor had thrown at her husband in Antioch was picked up, dusted off, and turned into official policy. The end, when it came, was almost gentle by the standards of everything around it. On the 21st of March, 1152, at the royal castle of Beaugency on the Loire, a council of archbishops and barons annulled the marriage of Louis and Eleanor on grounds of consanguinity in the 4th degree. 15 years of marriage dissolved in an afternoon on a technicality of shared great-great-grandparents that everyone had known about on the wedding day. The settlement gave Eleanor back her duchy in full. She walked out of Beaugency as she had entered her first marriage, the ruling Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the richest people alive, and she walked out without her children. Marie was about 7. Alex was about 2. The law on this was not even a question. Children of a king belonged to the king. Both girls were declared legitimate. Both stayed in their father's custody. And both were, in time, married into the House of Champagne, the family their mother's sister had helped drag into a war. Eleanor was around 28. As far as the records show, she saw little or nothing of her daughters for the rest of her life. No letters between them survive. Whatever she felt about it went wherever her private feelings always went, and we simply do not have it. She got on her horse and rode south for Poitiers, and the wolves came out immediately. She was a divorced woman of 28 in possession of 1/3 of France, travelling with a small escort through lands full of ambitious men, and the news of her annulment moved faster than she did. At Blois, the young Count Theobald V had a plan ready to detain her and marry her, willing or otherwise. She got wind of it and slipped out of danger by night, taking a boat down the Loire in the dark rather than risk the roads. Further south, near the crossing of the River Creuse, at a place called Port de Pile, a second ambush was waiting, and the man behind this one was Geoffrey of Anjou, a boy of about 16, the younger brother of the man Eleanor intended to marry. He meant to take his brother's intended bride by force at a river crossing and make her lands his own. She was warned in time, and one account says the warning came from her guardian angel, doing a lot of unglamorous work through her scouts. She swung off the expected route, took back ways south, and came into Poitiers with both traps sprung empty behind her. 2 abduction attempts inside a fortnight. That was the market value of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she understood it better than anyone. An unmarried duchess would be hunted until somebody caught her, so she chose her own hunter, and she chose fast. From Poitiers she sent messengers north to Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and told him to come and marry her without delay. They had met the previous summer when Henry and his father visited the French court, and whatever passed between them then, the gossips later filled in with enthusiasm. On the 18th of May, 1152, Whit Sunday, roughly 8 weeks after the annulment, Eleanor married Henry in the cathedral at Poitiers, quietly, without, as one chronicler put it, the pomp and ceremony that befitted their rank. She was about 30, he was 19, and with one signature the map of Europe tore in half. Henry now held Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine, a block of territory running from the English Channel to the Pyrenees, and he had a claim to the English crown on top of it. Louis had let his ex-wife carry a third of his kingdom into the arms of his most dangerous vassal. He is said to have been wounded on a personal level as well, and he responded the way kings respond, by declaring the marriage illegal, on the grounds that both parties owed him homage and neither had asked his permission, and by invading Normandy in a coalition that included, of all people, Henry's brother Geoffrey, the failed kidnapper of Port-de-Peel. Henry took the coalition apart in a matter of weeks, with a speed that left contemporaries a little frightened, hammered his brother's castles, and got back to the business of England. In 1154, King Stephen died, and on the 19th of December, Henry and Eleanor were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. She was Queen of England before her 32nd birthday, wearing her second crown, visibly pregnant with her second son, while across the water, her first husband ruled a diminished kingdom with her 2 abandoned daughters in his nursery. We're going to spend the rest of this story with Henry II, so you should know what he was like, and the chroniclers left a vivid picture. Stocky, bull-necked, freckled, close-cropped reddish hair, grey eyes that were said to go bloodshot when the temper came up, legs bowed and scarred from a life spent on horseback. He couldn't sit still. He stood through meals, stood through mass, paced through council meetings picking at his hands, wore his court to exhaustion by changing his plans hourly and riding distances that killed horses. His energy was a weapon, and everyone around him knew it. And his rages were something else entirely. One royal clerk recorded an episode when the king, hearing praise of an enemy, tore off his clothes, ripped the silk cover from his bed, and rolled on the floor chewing the straw stuffing of the mattress. That is a first-hand description of the man Eleanor married, a man whose fits contemporaries connected to the family legend. The Counts of Anjou were said to carry demon blood. The story, told by courtiers like Gerald of Wales and Walter Map, went that an early count had married a mysterious, beautiful woman who always left mass before the consecration of the host, and when her husband finally had knights hold her down to make her stay, she screamed, tore free, and flew out through a high window of the church, never to be seen again, leaving her children behind. A daughter of Satan at the root of the family tree, the figure later storytellers called Melusine. Bernard of Clairvaux's line about the Angevins, "From the devil they came and to the devil they will return," was repeated across Europe, and the astonishing part is that Henry's own sons repeated it themselves. Richard the Lionheart used to say, apparently with some satisfaction, that his family came from the devil and would go back to the devil, and that it was no wonder they could not stop destroying one another. The family spent the next 40 years proving it. One more piece of poison was poured into the foundations early, and it comes from Gerald of Wales, a court insider with a grudge, writing after Henry's death. Gerald claimed that Henry's own father, Geoffrey the Handsome, Count of Anjou, had slept with Eleanor while she was still Queen of France, and had warned his son on that account never to touch her. Gerald even names his chain of sources, saying he had it from the saintly Bishop Hugh of Lincoln, who had it from Henry himself. Walter Map, another courtier with a taste for scandal, repeats the same rumour that Eleanor was secretly said to have shared the couch of Henry's father, and adds that she was suspected of it before the marriage. If true, her second marriage was incestuous by the Church's rules in a far uglier way than her first. Modern historians point out that Gerald hated the whole Angevin family with a rare passion, that he gets checkable details wrong in the same passage, and that the story surfaces only after everyone involved was safely dead. That is the accusation as the 12th century gave it. What matters for our story is that this is the atmosphere Eleanor lived in. Every marriage she made, every man she spoke with, every decision she took, got rewritten somewhere as appetite. For a while, though, the second marriage worked, and worked spectacularly. Eleanor spent the first 13 years of it in a state of almost continuous pregnancy, and here is the roll call of her children with Henry. We are going to bury most of them together. William came first, in 1153, born while his father was still fighting for the crown. Henry, called the young king, in 1155. Matilda in 1156. Richard in 1157, Geoffrey in 1158, Eleanor, called after her mother, in 1161, Joan in 1165, and John, the last, in 1166, when his mother was in her early 40s. 8 children in 13 years, on top of the 2 daughters in France, 10 pregnancies carried in an age when childbirth was the most dangerous thing a woman could do. Every lying in meant weeks of confinement in a shuttered, overheated room, a birth with no relief for pain and no remedy for bleeding, and a real chance of dying in that bed. Queens died that way constantly, and their babies died faster. Eleanor delivered 10 times across more than 20 years and walked away from every childbed, and the plain fact of that outlasts most of the legends about her. The first grief of the new family arrived early. Little William, the firstborn, the heir to everything, died in 1156 at 3 years old, while his father was abroad and his mother was pregnant with Matilda. Nobody recorded the sickness. He was buried at Reading Abbey at the feet of his great-grandfather, King Henry I. One small coffin laid against a king's tomb, and the court moved on. The nursery was filling, and dynasties did not stop for dead 3-year-olds. His mother's feelings, as usual, are nowhere in the record. She had already learned the first rule of her position. A queen's job was to produce children faster than God could take them. Through the 1150s and into the 1160s, Eleanor was a working partner in the running of an empire. When Henry crossed to the continent, she governed England, issued writs in her own name, presided over the exchequer, moved with the itinerant court through a kingdom that was, in effect, a construction site for the Plantagenet machine. The marriage produced children and functioned as a firm. What it stopped producing, somewhere in the 1160s, was anything resembling affection. Henry was unfaithful on a scale that even his admirers didn't bother denying. Gerald of Wales, cataloguing the king's mistresses, describes a procession of them, and 2 bore him acknowledged bastards, whom he raised at court in his wife's household alongside her own children. One of those bastards, another Geoffrey, will matter later. He turned out to be the only son who never betrayed him. Eleanor endured the parade for years the way queens were expected to. Then, around 1167 or 1168, with her childbearing done and her marriage cold, she did something almost no queen of the age managed. She left. With Henry's consent, on paper anyway, she moved her household back to her own capital of Poitiers to rule her own duchy in person, and she took her favourite son Richard with her to raise him as its heir. She was in her mid-40s, done with the nursery, done, apparently, with the marriage bed, and back in the palace where her grandfather had once hung his mistress's portrait on his shield. If her life had ended there, in her own hall with her own poets, she would be a footnote of triumph. Instead, the road into her duchy opened with an ambush and a murder, and her court at Poitiers turned out to be the staging ground for the catastrophe of her life. The ambush came in 1168, and it introduced one of the great supporting characters of the whole era. Eleanor was travelling through Poitou under the escort of Earl Patrick of Salisbury, when riders of the Lusignan family, a clan of Poitevin barons in permanent rebellion against anyone who claimed authority over them, fell on the party from ambush. The attack came so suddenly that Earl Patrick had no time to arm. He was mounting his horse, unarmoured, when a Lusignan knight drove a sword through him from behind, and he died on the road in front of his men. Killing an unarmed earl from the back was, even by the loose standards of Poitevin politics, a scandal. Eleanor got clear, spurring for a nearby castle while her escort bought her the time with their bodies. Among those doing the buying was the dead earl's nephew, a 21-year-old landless knight named William Marshall, who reportedly set his back against a hedge and fought the ambushers on foot like, in the words of his biographer, a boar among hounds, until a blade thrust through the hedge went into his thigh. His captors hauled him off bleeding, and in a nasty little detail his biography preserves, denied him treatment while they dragged him around so that he had to tie off his own wound with the bandages of his leggings. Eleanor paid his ransom personally. She had watched from horseback while this young man bled to cover her escape, and she brought him back, equipped him, and set him on the path that ended with him serving 5 kings of England, and being called, at his funeral, the greatest knight that ever lived. William Marshall comes back into this story at one of its darkest doors, carrying her freedom in his hands. Poitiers under Eleanor became, at least in tradition, the most glamorous court in Europe. Troubadours sang for the Duchess as they had sung for her grandfather. Later, writers claimed she presided over formal courts of love, where noble ladies sat in judgment on questions of romance, and connected her daughter Marie of Champagne, the child she had left behind in France, to the enterprise. How much of that is real, and how much is a later dream about the South, scholars have argued over for a century. What sat underneath the poetry is documented well enough. Eleanor spent these years knitting her unruly barons to her son Richard, having him formally installed as heir to Aquitaine in ceremonies drenched in symbolism, seating the boy in the abbey church of Saint-Hilaire, giving her duchy a future that ran through her bloodline rather than her husband's crown. Richard was her project and her favorite, and everyone knew it, and across the water, Henry was making decisions about their other sons that turned the whole family into a loaded weapon. Meanwhile, in England, the king had a mistress unlike the others, and her story grew into one of the great dark legends of the English Middle Ages, with Eleanor cast as its monster. The woman's actual name was Rosamond Clifford, daughter of Walter de Clifford, a knight of the Welsh border. She was young, reportedly very beautiful, and Henry seems to have genuinely loved her, in whatever way that restless man loved anything. He kept her at his palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire, where building accounts show real money spent on a strange and lovely complex called Everswell, a cloistered garden of pools and channels fed by a spring, with a chamber that later generations called Rosamond's Chamber. By 1174, Henry had dropped all pretense and acknowledged her openly as his mistress, parading the relationship at exactly the moment his wife became his prisoner. Around 1176, still in her 20s, Rosamond withdrew from the world to the nunnery at Godstow near Oxford, where she had been schooled as a girl, and there, within a year or so, she died. No chronicler wrote down what killed her. A young woman, a quiet retreat, a death, a silence. The 12th century left it at that. The centuries after could not leave it alone, and watching the story grow is like watching a stain spread. Gerald of Wales, closest in time, contents himself with a sneer, punning that she was not really Rosa Mundi, the rose of the world, but Rosa Immundi, the rose of unchastity. The verdict of a moralist, nothing more. Around 200 years later, a French chronicle adds a scene with no known earlier source, that the jealous queen hunted the girl down and dealt with her. And in one especially lurid version, the queen has Rosamond stripped and roasted between two fires, with venomous toads set on her breasts, and bled to death in a scalding bath while the queen watches. Ranulph Higden, an English monk of the 1300s, contributes the famous architecture, a labyrinth at Woodstock, a maze of walls and hedges built by the king so that no one could reach his love, with Rosamond hidden at the centre of it like treasure. Tudor writers pick up the thread from there, quite literally. In their telling, Eleanor finds her way through the maze by following a strand of silk that had snagged on the king's spur and unspooled behind him all the way to the secret bower. By 1580, John Stow's chronicle has fixed the ending most people still know. The queen at the centre of the labyrinth, the trembling girl, and a choice offered with terrible courtesy, a dagger or a bowl of poison. Rosamond drinks. By about 1611, that scene is settled tradition, and the ballad singers carried it into every alehouse in England, along with a companion piece in which an aged Queen Eleanor, dying, confesses her crimes to two friars who turn out to be her husband and William Marshal in disguise, and the crimes include poisoning fair Rosamond. Songs, all of it, written centuries after everyone involved was dust. One hard, awkward fact sits beside all of it. From 1173 onward, the Queen was locked in a castle under guard, and Rosamond died around 1176. Decide for yourself what a prisoner 100 miles away could have arranged. The ballad makers knew the dates as well as anyone. They just liked the story with the poison in it better. The real ending at Godstow has its own quiet horror, and this part is documented. Henry paid for Rosamond to be buried before the high altar of the convent church, an outrageous honor for a king's mistress, and he endowed the nuns so generously that they tended the tomb like a shrine, draped in silk, lit with candles, for years. In 1191, after Henry was dead, Bishop Hugh of Lincoln visited Godstow and found the nuns of a holy house keeping lamps burning over a harlot's grave, as he saw it, and he ordered her dug up. The nuns exhumed the bones of a woman 15 years dead and reburied them outside the church, in the chapter house, and later tradition says they gathered what was left into a perfumed leather bag inside a leaden casket. A legend of her tomb inscription made the rounds afterward, a cruel little Latin verse punning on her name, saying, "Here lies in the tomb the rose of the world, not a clean rose. She who used to smell sweet still smells, but not sweet." Even her bones weren't allowed to rest with any dignity. Whatever Rosamond Clifford actually was, a predatory king's teenage acquisition or a great romance or both at once, she went into the ground twice, and the second time was on the orders of a saint. Back up a few years now, to the event that put blood on this family's hands in front of all Christendom, since you cannot understand the disasters of the 1170s without the Archbishop. Thomas Becket had been Henry's chancellor, his drinking companion, his closest friend, a brilliant and extravagantly worldly man. And in 1162 Henry made him Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting a compliant church run by his best friend. Instead, Becket transformed overnight into the most inflexible defender of church privilege in Europe, and the friendship curdled into one of history's great feuds. 8 years of excommunications, exiles, and screaming matches over legal jurisdictions that ended in December 1170, with Becket back in England and promptly excommunicating the bishops who had crossed him. The news reached Henry keeping Christmas in Normandy, and the rage took him. The most often quoted version of what he shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" is a later Polish. What witnesses reported was, if anything, worse. The king raving about the miserable drones and traitors he had nourished in his household, who would let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk. 4 knights heard it. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton slipped out of the court that night, crossed the Channel separately and rode for Canterbury. They found Becket in his palace on the afternoon of the 29th of December, 1170, and tried to arrest him. He refused to go. They went back outside, put on their armor under the trees, and came in again as the monks were hurrying the archbishop into the cathedral for vespers. The monks tried to bar the doors, and Becket ordered the doors opened, saying a church was not a fortress. So the knights came into the darkening cathedral with drawn swords, shouting, "Where is the traitor? Where is Thomas Becket?" and found him standing by a pillar between the altars. What happened next was written down by a man standing close enough to be maimed by it, a clerk named Edward Grimm, who threw his arm up to shield the archbishop from the first sword stroke. The blade sliced through Grimm's arm nearly to the bone and carried on into the crown of Becket's head, shearing off the top of his scalp. A second blow landed on his head. He stood through both. Then a third stroke dropped him to his knees and he went down onto his face on the stones, murmuring by Grimm's account that he accepted death for the name of Jesus and the defense of the church. The fourth blow from Richard le Breton came down with such force that it took off the whole crown of the skull and the sword snapped on the pavement beneath. And then a fifth man, a clerk called Hugh of Horsier, who had come in with the knights and would carry the nickname Mauclerc, evil clerk, for the rest of his life, set his foot on the dead man's neck, put the point of his sword into the open skull, and scooped the brains out onto the cathedral floor, scattering blood and brain across the stones, and called to the others, "We can be off, knights. This fellow will not get up again." The town came into the church afterward with cloths and bowls and dipped up the blood. The blood of a martyr was the most powerful medicine on earth, and miracles were being reported within days. When the monks undressed the body that night, they found underneath the archbishop's robes a monk's habit, and under that a hair shirt, and the hair shirt was alive with lice. The great worldly chancellor had been secretly mortifying his flesh the whole time, crawling with vermin under the vestments, and the discovery sealed the sainthood on the spot. Becket was canonized in 1173, one of the fastest canonizations ever recorded, and his shrine became the greatest pilgrimage site in England for the next 3.5 centuries. Henry, for his part, spent the rest of his life dragging the murder behind him. In July 1174, with his kingdom in flames, he walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury in a plain wool shirt, knelt at the tomb and submitted to a public flogging, 5 strokes of the rod from each bishop and abbot present, 3 from each of the 80 monks, one after another down the line, then lay all night on the bare floor beside the tomb, fasting in his bloodied shirt among the pilgrims. A king of England, scourged like a penitent schoolboy in front of his own subjects. Europe was still absorbing that image while his queen sat in his prison, and to see how she got there, we need her sons. By the early 1170s, Henry's boys were growing into exactly what you'd expect from that bloodline. The eldest surviving son, young Henry, had been given a coronation, a custom that sounds strange to modern ears. In 1170, following continental custom, Henry had his 15-year-old heir crowned King of England while he himself was still alive, an insurance policy for the succession. The ceremony was performed by the Archbishop of York, with Canterbury in exile, and Becket's fury at that usurped privilege was one of the sparks of the final quarrel. So you can draw a straight line from that coronation to the brains on the cathedral floor. England now had 2 crowned kings, and the younger one had all of the title and none of the substance. His father gave him money, tournaments, a glittering household, and absolutely no power. He controlled no lands and no revenues at 18, at 20, while contemporaries openly called him a king without a kingdom. His brother Richard at least had Aquitaine promised through their mother, and Geoffrey had Brittany through his betrothal, and even little John, the landless afterthought his own father nicknamed Lackland, was about to be provided for, and the providing lit the fuse. In 1173, negotiating a marriage for 5-year-old John, Henry casually assigned him 3 castles out of the inheritance already promised to the young king, without asking the young king. The heir, humiliated one time too many, slipped away from his father's court by night and rode for Paris, to the court of King Louis of France, his father-in-law, his father's oldest enemy, and his mother's discarded first husband, who received him with open arms and every intention of using him. And here Eleanor did the thing that defined her in the eyes of her age. Her 2 younger sons, Richard, 15, and Geoffrey, 14, were with her at Poitiers. She sent them to Paris to join their brother's rebellion, her own boys, dispatched from her own court to make war on their father. Beyond that, the rising in Poitou and Aquitaine was organized around her and her barons, and contemporaries had no doubt whose hand was on it. Whether you see a mother finally striking back at a husband who had humiliated her for 2 decades, or a sovereign duchess defending her duchy's independence from an overreaching empire, or something colder, the sources will support any of them, and the sources were at the time unanimous about one thing only. What she had done was against nature. Wives incited nothing, queens obeyed. The public scolding arrived on official parchment. Rotrou, Archbishop of Rouen, writing at Henry's prompting but with the full moral authority of the Church behind him, sent Eleanor a letter that survives, and in it you can hear exactly how the 12th century processed a rebellious wife. He tells her that she has made the fruits of her union with her Lord King rise up against their father. He calls her conduct deplorable, reminds her that a wife is subject to her husband in everything, laments that a woman once so prudent should be the cause of such ruin, and delivers the instruction plainly: return with your sons to the husband whom you must obey, and with whom it is your duty to live. And then the threat, dressed in regret: unless she returns, the Archbishop writes, he will be compelled with sorrow and tears to bring the censure of the Church down upon her. Excommunication aimed at a queen for the crime of taking her children's side. She ignored it. The war came anyway, on a scale that stunned everyone, with risings in England, Normandy, Brittany, Anjou and Aquitaine at once. the King of France and the King of Scotland both piling in, and for about 18 months the whole Plantagenet empire shook. Henry, fighting on 5 fronts with mercenaries and pure stamina, beat all of them. And somewhere in the autumn of 1173, before her side had even fully lost, came that scene we started with, the road in northern Poitou, the riders, the woman in men's clothing pulled off her horse. Eleanor had left Poitiers ahead of her husband's advancing army, making for the French court and safety, and she was betrayed or unlucky or both. The soldiers who arrested her delivered her to Henry at Rouen, and then she disappears. For about a year, the records say nothing at all about the Queen of England while her husband decided what to do with her. When she surfaces, in July 1174, she is on a ship, and the passenger list of that crossing is its own little portrait of the family. Henry sailed for England to do his barefoot penance at Becket's tomb, and he brought with him, in the same fleet, his captive queen, his son John, his daughter Joan, and a cargo of captured rebel barons, heading for English prisons. A storm blew up mid-channel, and Henry, standing on deck, prayed aloud that if God meant him to be reconciled with the realm, the fleet should come safe to port. The fleet came safe to port, and Eleanor went into a captivity that lasted, with varying degrees of tightness, the rest of her husband's life, 15 to 16 years. She went in at about 50 and came out at about 65. Most of it she spent at Sarum, the castle now called Old Sarum outside Salisbury, and if you've ever stood on that site you'll know what a choice it was. A bare chalk hill in the Wiltshire downland, ringed by the massive earth banks of an Iron Age fort, with a Norman castle and a cathedral crammed inside the rings, wind coming across the plain with nothing to slow it down. Garrison, clergy, a cramped royal apartment in the keep, and the Queen. Her prison was gilded, but it was a prison. The government's own account rolls track her existence in scraps of expenditure, the wages of her keeper, cloth for her household, at one point a scarlet cloak, furs, an embroidered coverlet, and the records show she was attended for years by a single lady, a gentlewoman named Amaria, where once she had commanded a household of hundreds. She was moved between castles as politics dictated, Sarum, Winchester, occasionally elsewhere, and trotted out under guard for the odd ceremonial Christmas court when Henry wanted to display family unity to ambassadors. He also, in the late 1170s, explored ending the marriage entirely, sounding out a papal legate about an annulment, with one scheme floating the idea of retiring her as a nun, possibly as abbess of Fontevraud, a velvet oblivion for an inconvenient wife. She refused whatever was put to her, the legate wouldn't cooperate, and the scheme died. Notice the shape of her life here. The abbey her grandfather's humiliated wife had fled to was now being offered to her as a cell, and she said no, and would, decades later, choose the same walls freely on her own terms. In the meantime, the empire she had helped build went on without her. Her sons grew into men she barely saw, and her husband installed Rosamond Clifford in her place, with the doors open. The Queen of Two Kingdoms embroidered on a chalk hill in the wind and waited, and she was extraordinarily good at waiting. 2 of her daughters crossed the sea to their marriages while she sat under guard. Eleanor, the namesake, had gone to Castile at about 14 to marry King Alfonso, and in 1176 it was Joan's turn, 11 years old, shipped out to wed the King of Sicily. The chronicles track the bridal fleet down the French coast and on toward Palermo. Storms and seasickness included, a child carried across the water to a husband she had never seen. William of Sicily was in his early 20s, master of a rich island kingdom of mosaics, orange groves, and Arabic-speaking palace clerks, about as far from a Wiltshire chalk hill as the century could offer. Joan was crowned queen there at 12. A letter home, if she ever sent one, does not survive. Her mother had no part in any of it. Henry chose the husbands. Henry's clerks drew up the terms. Henry's officials packed the ships, and the prisoner at Sarum learned of her daughter's weddings the way she now learned everything, at second hand, from whoever was allowed near her. Whether such news arrived with kindness or as another turn of the screw depended entirely on the mood of the man who held the keys. Joan comes back into this story at its very end, in circumstances nobody at that glittering wedding could have stomached. The daughters wrote themselves into other countries' histories while the mother embroidered and the machinery of her confinement ground on, keepers paid. Allowances entered in the rolls, the same walls, the same wind off the plain. The next news that mattered came to her through a stranger, and it broke over the whole family in the summer of 1183. Her sons had begun devouring one another, exactly as the demon blood joke predicted. The young king and Geoffrey had turned on Richard, fighting him for control of Aquitaine with their father dragged in on Richard's side, and the war in the Limousin went feral. The young king, chronically broke, glittering, and 28, ran out of money to pay his mercenary bands and paid them by stripping the holiest places in the region. His men plundered the Abbey of Grandmont, the monastery his own father loved above all others and had chosen for his burial. Then the shrine of Saint Martial at Limoges. Then, in late May, the great cliff shrine of Rocamadour, where pilgrims climbed the rock on their knees, and the heir of England looted the treasury and, tradition says, carried off the ancient sword displayed there as Roland's own blade, leaving a lesser weapon in its place. Days after Rocamadour, in the town of Martel, sickness took him. Dysentery, the flux, the same disease that ran through every medieval army, and it is a foul way to die. Days of gripping abdominal pain, uncontrollable bloody diarrhea, the body voiding itself past any replacing, fever climbing while the flesh visibly sinks, and the sick room stinking so badly that attending the dying was itself an act of penance. He understood quickly that it was killing him, and he understood, in the terms of his world, why. He had robbed God's houses to fund a war against his own father. Judgment had found him in an upstairs room in Martel. What he did with his last days became one of the most famous deathbed performances of the century, and performance is the right word, though nobody doubted his sincerity. He sent a messenger begging his father to come to him, to forgive him face to face. Henry, 20 miles away besieging Limoges, wanted to go. His counselors talked him out of it, reminding him how many times this son had lied, warning that the illness could be bait for an ambush. And so the king sent, instead of himself, a sapphire ring that had belonged to his grandfather, Henry I, a family relic, as a token that the forgiveness was real. The dying man confessed his sins over and over. He had himself stripped of his fine clothes and dressed in a hair shirt with the Crusaders' cross laid on him. He had vowed to go to Jerusalem and now never would. And then he ordered his attendants to put a rope around his neck and drag him by it from his bed, like a condemned criminal being hauled to the gallows, onto a bed of ashes strewn across the floor, with bare stones placed under his head and under his feet. The full ancient ritual of the dying penitent, performed by the crowned king of the English. He lay in the ashes clutching his father's sapphire ring, and with his last breaths, he asked those around him to beg the king to show mercy to his mother, the queen, and to release her. He died on the 11th of June, 1183, 28 years old, and his father, when the news reached the siege lines, collapsed into a grief that frightened people, crying out that the son had cost him much, but he wished he had lived to cost him more. Even the corpse caused a war, and I mean that literally. The funeral procession set out north in the summer heat, and the body had been dealt with in the usual way for a travelling royal corpse, the entrails and softer parts removed and buried locally, at Grandmont of all places, the abbey he had robbed, and the rest salted and sewn up for the journey. When the procession reached Le Mans, the townspeople were so hungry for the relic glamour of a dead young king that they simply took him, buried him in their own cathedral, and refused to give him up. Rouen, where he had asked to be buried, threatened to come and get him by force. His father had to intervene, and the body of Henry the young king was dug out of its grave at Le Mans and carried on to Rouen for a second burial, fought over in death by two cities, as he had never quite been fought for in life. His tournament companion William Marshal took the cross from the dead man's shoulders and carried it to Jerusalem to fulfill the vow for him. And that is the errand that kept Marshal out of the worst of what came next. The news went to the prisoner at Sarum, and the account of how it arrived is one of the strangest documents connected with her. Thomas Agnellus, an English cleric, preached a sermon on the dead young king, and in it he tells how the archdeacon sent to break the news to Eleanor found her calm. She had already seen it, she said. In a dream she had seen her son lying still with his hands joined like a tomb effigy, and on his head 2 crowns, the one below of familiar earthly gold, and above it a second crown of pure, unbearable light, brilliance with no admixture, of a clarity nothing on earth could match. She understood the dream to mean her son had exchanged 1 crown for another, and she received the confirmation of his death, the cleric says, with more composure than the men who brought it. A grieving mother's consolation, a preacher's embellishment, or a genuine dream. Whichever it was, notice what it tells you. 10 years into her imprisonment, the world found Eleanor of Aquitaine unbroken, still thinking in images of sovereignty. Her captivity actually eased slightly after this. Her son's dying wish and Henry's grief bought her escorted outings, supervised appearances, a Christmas court or two with what remained of the family arranged around the table like a truce. The pipe rolls resumed their little entries of cloth and wine, and the family kept dying. Geoffrey went next. Duke of Brittany by marriage, the cleverest of the brothers by most accounts, and the least trustworthy by all of them. A smooth, faithless intriguer whom Gerald of Wales described as a hypocrite able to corrupt 2 kingdoms with his tongue, Geoffrey had by 1186 drifted into the orbit of the young King Philip of France, Louis's son and successor, a colder and far more dangerous animal than his father. Geoffrey was at Philip's court in Paris in August of that year, deep in whatever scheme the 2 of them were building against his father, when he entered a tournament. The melee of that era was barely distinguishable from battle, massed charges of armoured horsemen in an open field, and Geoffrey came off his horse in the press and went under the hooves. Trampled, the French chroniclers say, crushed on the field at 27, though an English tradition records instead that he died of a sudden sickness, a fever of the chest, and you can take your pick of a duke dying under horses or in a bed. Either way, the reaction of the King of France became a scandal in itself. Philip's grief was so extravagant, so far beyond protocol, that at the funeral in Notre Dame, he had to be physically restrained from throwing himself into the open grave after the coffin. Historians have chewed on that scene ever since. Political theatre, genuine friendship, or something the sources had no vocabulary for. Geoffrey left a pregnant widow, and the child born the following spring, a boy named Arthur, matters more than all the others in this crowd of grandchildren. His terrible story is coming, and Eleanor is in it to the end. Count the household now as the 1180s close. William dead at 3, young Henry dead in the ashes at Martel, Geoffrey dead under the horses in Paris. In June 1189, word came from Germany that Matilda, Eleanor's eldest daughter with Henry, Duchess of Saxony, was dead at 33. Of the 8 children Eleanor had borne Henry, 4 were gone, and the survivors were circling their father like the birds in his own painting. Henry kept, in a chamber at Winchester Castle, close to where his wife was held, a wall painting he had commissioned himself. An eagle and 4 eaglets tearing at it, 2 ripping at its wings, a 3rd at its breast, and the 4th, the smallest, perched on the parent's neck, waiting to peck out its eyes. When people asked what it meant, Henry would explain it plainly. The eaglets were his 4 sons, who would persecute him to the death, and the youngest, the one he loved and embraced most tenderly, would in the end injure him more grievously than all the rest together. He commissioned that. He walked visitors past it. A man decorating his own palace with a prophecy of being eaten by his children, and naming John, his darling, as the one who would take the eyes. The prophecy on the wall came due in the summer of 1189, and Henry II's last weeks are among the most wretched of any English king. Richard, now the eldest surviving son, wanted his inheritance confirmed and suspected, with some reason, that his father meant to disinherit him in favour of John. So Richard did the family thing and allied with Philip of France, and the 2 of them went to war against the old king, who was 56, exhausted and sick with an internal complaint his physicians could name only by its effects, most likely a bleeding ulcer eating him from the inside. They chased him out of Le Mans, the city of his birth, the city where his father was buried, and the manner of the losing was almost theatrical cruelty. Henry's own men fired the suburbs to cover the retreat. The wind swung, and the flames jumped into the city itself, so the king sat his horse on a hill and watched his birthplace burn behind him by his own order. Gerald of Wales records what he said up there, grudge and all. Since God had taken from him the city he loved best on earth, Henry declared, he would repay God as best he could, by robbing God of the thing God loved best in him, his soul. A dying king, cursing God to his face on a burning hill. That was the state of him when they cornered him. By early July he could barely stay on a horse. At Colombières, propped upright in the saddle by his attendants because he refused to negotiate lying down, he submitted to every demand Richard and Philip made, a complete surrender, and asked only for one thing, a list of the names of the men who had gone over to his enemies, so he would know who had abandoned him. The list was drawn up and brought to him at Chinon, and the clerk began reciting it aloud, and the first name on the list was John, the son he had torn the inheritance apart for, the eaglet at the neck. Witnesses say Henry turned his face to the wall and stopped fighting, and in the 2 days of fever and delirium that remained to him, the words that kept surfacing were, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." Earlier, when only his illegitimate son Geoffrey stayed by the sick bed while the legitimate ones made war on him, he had already delivered his own verdict on the family, telling the bastard that he alone had proved himself the true son, and the others were the real bastards. He died at Chinon on the 6th of July, 1189, and then his own household delivered the last insult. The servants and hangers-on stripped the room and stripped the corpse, taking the rings, the clothes, the plate, everything portable, and abandoned the King of England lying half naked in the sick room until someone found a short cloak to throw over him. Chroniclers noted the black symmetry. Henry's nickname from his youth had been Curt Mantle, short cloak, after the little riding capes he favoured, and a short cloak was all he was left in death. The identical thing had happened to William the Conqueror a century before, and it happened whenever a king died. A dead king protects nothing and pays no one, and the loyalty of a royal household lasted exactly as long as the breathing. They carried him the few miles to Fontevraud, the abbey of his family's women, and laid him out in state, and Richard came to look at what he had done. The chronicle tradition adds a detail here that the 12th century took very seriously. As the sun approached the bier, blood began to run from the dead king's nostrils, and everyone present knew what that meant. A corpse was believed to bleed in the presence of its killer. Richard stood by the body for about the length of a prayer, showing nothing, then turned and walked out to take possession of an empire. Whatever else was in his head, one of his first recorded acts as king was an order sent across the Channel to Winchester: "Release the Queen." William Marshal, back from Jerusalem and freshly forgiven for nearly killing Richard in the last campaign, carried the order to England. The forgiveness took some doing. Marshal had unhorsed the new king in a skirmish days earlier and put his lance through Richard's horse instead of Richard to make a point about what he could have done. In England he found, in the words of his biographer, that the Queen had already been freed and was more powerful than ever. Of course she was. Eleanor at 65 came out of 16 years of confinement like a spring releasing. Roger of Howden describes her progress that summer, moving from city to city and castle to castle in queenly state, holding courts, taking oaths of loyalty to Richard, and, in the act everyone remembered, throwing open the prisons. She proclaimed a general amnesty, freeing prisoners across England, and Howden preserves the reasoning she gave. She had learned by her own experience that prisons were hateful to men, and to be released from them was a most delightful refreshment to the spirit, a queen legislating from inside her own scar tissue. The propaganda value was enormous. Every freed man became Richard's grateful subject, and she knew that perfectly well, and both things can be true at once. Richard was crowned at Westminster on the 3rd of September, 1189, in a ceremony of enormous splendor, and the day ended in blood that had nothing to do with the family and everything to do with the age. Jewish community leaders arrived bearing gifts for the new king and were barred from the coronation feast, and the crowd at the doors turned on them, beating the delegation, and the violence rolled out into London as a full pogrom. Houses of Jewish families burned through the night, residents murdered in the streets or given the choice of baptism, and the fires burned so close that they threatened the feast itself. Richard hanged a few rioters, mostly for burning Christian houses by accident, and sailed off on crusade within the year, and copycat massacres broke out across England in his wake, ending the following spring at York, where the entire Jewish community, besieged in the royal castle, killed their own families and themselves rather than fall into the mob's hands, and the survivors who surrendered on promise of mercy were slaughtered anyway. Around 150 people died at York alone. None of that is Eleanor's doing, but it is the England she was now effectively running. With Richard gone to the Holy Land, the old queen stood at the centre of the regency, watching the officials, watching the coasts, and above all watching John, who had been loaded with lands and told to stay out of England, and who started scheming before his brother's sails were over the horizon. She also, in these years, did the family's marrying, and the logistics alone are hard to believe. In the winter of 1190 to 91, aged around 66, Eleanor travelled to Navarre, collected the Princess Berengaria as a bride for Richard, and personally escorted the girl across the Alps in winter, down the length of Italy, and delivered her to Richard's crusade fleet at Messina in Sicily, then turned around and headed back north to mind the shop. A woman in her late 60s, in the 12th century, crossing alpine passes in the snow on horseback, on dynastic business. She would do something even harder at nearly 80. First, though, her son fell off the map. Richard's crusade ended in stalemate and treaty in late 1192, and he sailed for home into a continent full of his enemies. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, he tried to sneak overland through Austria in disguise, straight through the lands of Duke Leopold, who nursed a very personal grievance. Richard had torn down the Duke's banner at the capture of Acre and insulted him in front of the entire crusade. A few days before Christmas, 1192, in an inn outside Vienna, the disguise failed. One tradition has the King of England caught turning a spit in the kitchen, playing a servant, with a magnificent jewelled ring still on his finger that no kitchen boy on earth could own. Leopold locked him in the castle of Dürnstein above the Danube, and for weeks nobody in England knew where their king was, or whether he was alive, and out of that blackout later centuries spun the pretty legend of Blondel, the faithful minstrel wandering from castle to castle singing under windows until a familiar voice sang the second verse back. What actually pulled Richard into the light was uglier, a straightforward transfer of merchandise. Leopold sold his prisoner up the chain to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who put the King of England on trial before the imperial court on trumped-up charges, held him at castles including the mountain fortress of Trifles, where he was reportedly guarded day and night by men with drawn swords, and named his price: 150,000 marks of silver. Set that against the entire annual revenue of the English crown, which ran somewhere around £22,000, and the ransom comes out at roughly 2 to 3 times everything England produced for its king in a year. Something on the order of 34 tons of silver for one man. Eleanor took charge of raising it, and the operation she ran was one of the most ruthless fiscal extractions of the entire Middle Ages, and this time the word ruthless is simply accurate. Every person in England, clergy and laity alike, was assessed a quarter of their annual income and a quarter of the value of their movable goods. The wool crop of the Cistercian monasteries, their whole livelihood for the year, was taken. Church treasuries were emptied, the gold and silver plate, the chalices, the jeweled crosses off the altars, carted away under receipt with a promise of eventual repayment that everyone understood to be theoretical. Parish by parish, the kingdom was squeezed until it creaked, twice over in fact, once the first collection came up short. And while the old queen wrung England dry, her youngest son tried to make sure it was all for nothing. John and Philip of France jointly offered the emperor 80,000 marks to keep Richard locked up, a straight counterbid. Brother against brother at auction, and the emperor was tempted enough to dangle the letter in front of Richard. The German princes, who had guaranteed the deal, shamed their emperor into honouring it. From these terrible months come the letters, and whatever the scholarly fine print, they are the closest thing we have to Eleanor's voice raised in pain. 3 letters to Pope Celestine III survive in her name, drafted almost certainly by the professional stylist Peter of Blois, and there is no proof they were ever actually sent, but the fury in them is specific, personal, and hers. She styles herself in the most famous phrase, Eleanor, by the wrath of God, Queen of England, a razor through the standard formula by the grace of God. She rails at the Pope for doing nothing while a Crusader king rots in chains. Pitiful and pitied by no one, she writes, "Why have I come to the ignominy of this detestable old age, who was ruler of 2 kingdoms, mother of 2 kings? My guts are torn from me, my family is carried off and removed from me. The young king and the Count of Brittany sleep in dust, and their most unhappy mother is compelled to be irremediably tormented by the memory of the dead." She calls Richard the staff of her age and the light of her eyes, and she rounds on the most powerful churchman alive with a line you can still feel the edge on. "Give me back my son, man of God, if you are a man of God and not a man of blood." An old woman threatening the Pope. The letters did nothing, the silver did everything, and in January 1194, Eleanor herself, past 70, crossed to Germany with the ransom convoy to make the exchange in person, standing in the imperial court at Mainz on the 4th of February, when her son was finally handed over into her hands. The record notes, released specifically to his mother. Philip of France sent John a message that has become justly famous. Look to yourself, the devil is loose. The devil forgave his brother, incidentally, and the scene tells you everything about how this family understood itself. John came crawling, and Richard, with Eleanor presiding over the reconciliation, pardoned him with contempt so total it circled around into mercy, telling him he was a child who had been led astray by bad advisors. John was 27. Then Richard went back to war with Philip, 5 more years of grinding campaign to recover what had been lost during the captivity, and Eleanor at last withdrew to the Abbey of Fontevraud, to the community that kept collecting her family, intending, reasonably enough at 70 plus, to be done. The world gave her 5 quiet years, then took the light of her eyes. Richard's death shows how little the Middle Ages cared about narrative justice. In March 1199, the most famous warrior in Christendom, survivor of crusade, shipwreck and imperial dungeon, was besieging a castle so minor most of his own army had probably never heard of it. Chalut-Chabrol in the Limousin, in a squalid dispute with the Viscount of Limoges that rumour dressed up with a story about a hoard of Roman gold ploughed up in a field, treasure the Viscount refused to surrender to his lord. The castle held maybe 40 people, and of those only a couple were actual knights. The garrison was so short of equipment that one defender on the walls was using a frying pan as a shield, knocking crossbow bolts aside with kitchenware, and the besiegers had been watching him do it with professional amusement. On the evening of the 26th of March, Richard walked the siege lines after supper to inspect the progress of his miners, and he went out without his mail shirt, carrying only a shield close enough to the walls to be shot at. He had done this 1,000 times. The man with the frying pan, a crossbowman whose name comes down variously as Pierre Basile or Bertrand de Gudon, took his shot, and Richard, seeing it coming, applauded him, actually cheered the man's nerve and misjudged the dodge. The bolt went into him at the base of the neck by the left shoulder and sank deep. He tried to be casual about it, riding back to his tent as though nothing had happened, and then, in privacy, tried to pull the bolt out himself. The wooden shaft snapped off in his hand, leaving the iron head buried in the muscle. A surgeon attached to the mercenary captain Mercadier, a man one chronicler calls Mercadier's butcher, went in after it by torchlight, cutting and digging in the king's shoulder until he got the iron out, and mangling the wound thoroughly in the process. Within days, the flesh around it began to die. Gangrene in that era had one trajectory, the tissue blackening and liquefying outward from the wound, the smell filling the tent, the poison moving into the blood, and the patient conscious and lucid for most of it, entirely aware of what was happening to him. Richard had watched enough men die of wounds to diagnose himself. He arranged his affairs, named John his heir over the claims of his nephew Arthur, and sent a rider to Fontevraud for his mother. Eleanor was around 75, and she came out of her retirement at a pace that shames the young, riding through the nights with a small escort and the abbot of Turpenay, covering the roughly 100 miles to Charlus while her son still breathed. She made it. She was with him at the end, and before the end came one last scene, the one everyone remembers. Richard had the crossbowman brought to his tent, the man having been taken when the castle fell, and asked him, "What harm have I done you, that you have killed me?" The answer that comes down to us is steady. "You killed my father and my 2 brothers with your own hand, and you meant to kill me. Take what revenge you like. I will gladly endure the greatest torments you can devise, so long as you have met your end, you who have inflicted so many and such great evils on the world." And Richard, dying his slow black death, pardoned him, forgave the killing, ordered the man released, and directed he be given 100 shillings for his trouble. On the 6th of April, 1199, as the light went, Richard the Lionheart died in his mother's presence, 41 years old, killed by a boy with a frying pan defending a castle worth nothing. And the pardon lasted precisely as long as the pardoner. Once the king was dead, Mercadier had the crossbowman seized and had him flayed alive, the skin cut and stripped from his living body a piece at a time, the most prolonged agony the age knew how to inflict, and what was left of him was hanged. Every account of Richard's beautiful deathbed mercy comes with that attached, and the chroniclers who recorded the forgiveness recorded the flaying in the next line without any visible surprise. They divided Richard the way they divided all travelling kings. His entrails were buried at Chaluz in the ground of the siege that killed him. His heart was embalmed and enshrined at Rouen in Normandy, and a strange postscript arrived in our own century. In 2012, forensic scientists were given the remains of that heart, now a grey-brown powder in a leaden box, and analysed it, finding traces of frankincense, myrtle, mint and daisy in the embalming, incense on the heart of a king who had gone unshriven for years, joking that his hatred of Philip was too sincere to confess. And the body itself went where the family's bodies went, to Fontevraud, buried, at his own instruction, at the feet of the father he had hounded to death, placed there, the chroniclers say, as a posture of eternal repentance. Eleanor buried him herself and described herself afterward in a charter as a mother twice over destroyed. She wasn't finished burying children that year. In the autumn, her daughter Joan, Queen of Sicily and Countess of Toulouse, arrived heavily pregnant, fleeing her husband's wars, sick and desperate, and died at Rouen in childbirth in September 1199, having first, by an extraordinary dispensation, been veiled on her deathbed as a nun of Fontevraud, a dying pregnant woman received into the order as she went. The baby, delivered at the end, lived long enough to be baptized and died. Around the same time came word from Champagne and Blois that Marie and Alix, the 2 daughters of her French marriage, the ones she had lost at Beaugency half a century before, were dead as well. By the turn of the century, of the 10 children Eleanor of Aquitaine had carried, 2 were alive, John and her namesake Eleanor in Castile. She was about 76, and the century that was ending had eaten her whole family, and she still had 5 years of fighting left in her, since the last of her sons was about to demonstrate exactly what the eagle painting had promised. Her final campaigns began with a wedding errand that beggars belief. In the winter of 1200, to seal a peace between John and Philip of France, a granddaughter of Eleanor's was to marry the French heir, and rather than trust the choosing to ambassadors, Eleanor, now well past 75, crossed the Pyrenees in person, in winter, over the mountain passes into Castile, to inspect her daughter's daughters and pick the bride herself. 2 candidates, the story goes, and she passed over the elder, Urraca, for the younger, Blanca, with the court explanation that French tongues could not manage Urraca, though one suspects the old woman was judging more than names. She chose well beyond all measuring. Blanca became Blanche of Castile, Iron Regent of France and Mother of St. Louis, and an entire line of French kings descends from an old woman's eye for talent exercised on a freezing mountain road. On the return journey, as if the era wanted to remind her what roads were, she was waylaid and briefly held by Hugh de Lusignan, the same brigand family that had killed Earl Patrick beside her 30 years earlier, and she bought her way free by signing over a county, nearly 80, robbed at sword point in her own duchy, and she paid, delivered the bride, and rode on. Then came Mirabeau, and the last great scene of her life is a siege. By 1202, the war over John's crown had ignited properly, with Philip of France sponsoring the claim of Arthur of Brittany, Geoffrey's posthumous son, now 15 years old, knighted by Philip, betrothed to Philip's daughter, and hungry for everything. In late July, Eleanor was travelling toward Poitiers, when Arthur and his allies, the Lusignans among them, learned she was resting at the castle of Mirabeau with a small escort, and understood instantly what she was worth as a hostage. Her grandson marched on his own grandmother. The town fell fast, and Eleanor withdrew into the keep with her handful of men. A woman of about 78 held a tower against an army commanded by her 15-year-old grandchild, while his men settled into her town beneath her. She played for time, opening negotiations she had no intention of concluding, pretending to consider surrender terms, and while she talked, her messenger was through the lines and riding north. John was at Le Mans, roughly 80 to 100 miles away. He got the message and produced, for the only time in his life, a stroke worthy of his family, covering the distance with his mercenary army in about 48 hours of continuous forced march, and arriving before dawn on the 1st of August, 1202, while the besiegers slept. They had blocked every gate of the town but one, kept open for supplies, and John's vanguard under William de Roche came through it at first light. The surprise was total. Geoffrey de Lusignan was at breakfast, at a dish of roast pigeons, and by the testimony of the Chronicle, he refused to get up, announcing he would finish his meal first, and finished it, and was captured with the pigeon grease still on his fingers. Arthur was taken. Hugh de Lusignan was taken. Better than 200 knights and every man of rank in the army were taken. Not one of consequence escaped. And Eleanor walked out of the keep free, delivered by the son who had failed at everything else, and wrote, or had written, that she was rejoiced beyond anything. What John did with his victory poisoned everything it touched. And this is where his reign shows you its true face. The noble prisoners, men of rank entitled by every custom of the age to honourable captivity and ransom, were loaded into ox carts in chains, seated backward, facing the animals' tails, and paraded through their own countryside as a public spectacle of degradation, a humiliation contemporaries found shocking. You might kill a knight, you did not exhibit him like a felon in a dung cart. The carts rolled to the coast, and many of the prisoners were shipped to castles in England and at Corfe Castle in Dorset. On its high ridge above the Purbeck Hills, 22 of them were starved to death. Deliberate, administrative starvation, men of noble family locked in and simply not fed, day after day, while a garrison went about its business over their heads. Some of the Mirabeau prisoners were blinded. The disgust was so widespread that it broke John's own coalition, with William de Roche, the very commander who had stormed the gate for him, going over to the French in protest along with half of Anjou. And all of that was merely the surround for the central question everyone in Europe was quietly asking: where was Arthur? Trace what can be traced. The boy went first to the fortress of Falaise in Normandy, under the keeping of Hubert de Burgh, and the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, writing within a few years and with evident good sources, sets down what happened there. Certain of John's counsellors advised that the rebellion in Brittany would never end while Arthur was whole, and the king, enraged, sent men to Falaise with orders to blind the boy and castrate him, hot irons to the eyes, the knife below, mutilations calculated to leave the claimant alive but impossible. A maimed prince could inherit nothing. The men arrived, and Hubert de Burgh, at real risk to himself, would not permit it, either from pity for a terrified 16-year-old or from cold calculation that John would one day regret the order and hate whoever had carried it out. To cool the situation, Hubert put out word that Arthur had died of natural causes, and the announcement backfired spectacularly, since Brittany erupted at the news of its dead duke, and the death had to be hastily unannounced. The boy was alive after all, and he was moved, in the early months of 1203, to the Tower of Rouen, deeper into John's keeping, and out of the reach of merciful jailers. And from Rouen, Arthur of Brittany never came out. He was simply never seen again. No body was ever produced, and no explanation offered, and into that silence the chroniclers poured what they knew or believed. The annals of Margam Abbey in Wales, a house with close connections to families who had been at John's side, are the ones who name the night. After King John captured Arthur, they record, and kept him alive in prison for some time, at length in the castle of Rouen. After dinner on the Thursday before Easter, when he was drunk and possessed by the devil, he slew him with his own hand, and tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine. Maundy Thursday, 1203, the night the church washes feet. The account goes on. The body was discovered in the net of a fisherman, dragged to the bank and recognized, and taken for secret burial to the priory of Notre-Dame-des-Prés near Bec, in fear of the tyrant. A French chronicler, William the Breton, tells it differently, with John taking the boy out onto the river in a boat at night, killing him with his own sword, and giving the body to the water 3 miles out. 2 accounts, one uncle, one drowned nephew, and John never in his life offered any version of his own. Contemporaries noticed. An innocent king could simply have produced the prisoner. When King Philip's court summoned John to answer for Arthur and John failed to appear, the French crown declared his continental lands forfeit, and inside 3 years Normandy, Anjou, and most of the empire his parents had built was gone. Whatever happened in Rouen that night, John paid for it with half his inheritance. He was not finished collecting bodies, and one more family's fate closes the account, since it shows how far the secret's shadow reached. William de Braos was the baron who had personally captured Arthur at Mirabeau and had custody of him early on, a man who rose enormously in John's favour in the years after, favour with the specific texture of a man being paid for silence. When de Braos's fortunes eventually collapsed under his debts, John demanded his sons as hostages, and the baron's wife, Maud de Braos, said out loud to the king's officers the thing no one was permitted to say, that she would never hand her children to a man who had murdered his own nephew. For that sentence, her whole family was hunted from Wales to Ireland, and when Maud and her eldest son were finally taken, John had them imprisoned at Corfe by most accounts, or Windsor by others, and starved to death together in a cell. The tradition that reached the chroniclers says they were walled in with a sheaf of wheat and a piece of raw bacon. And 11 days later the cell was opened, and both were dead. The son first, sitting against the wall, and his mother found fallen between his knees, and her boy's cheeks carried the marks of her teeth, since in the extremity of her hunger, mad with it, the dying woman had gnawed the face of her dead child. That story ran through England, and it did more than any battle to make John's barons decide years later that this king needed a Magna Carta with a leash in it. And the last of the Breton children, Arthur's sister Eleanor, called the Fair Maid of Brittany, the old queen's granddaughter and namesake, was locked up after Mirabeau and simply never released, held courteously and absolutely, mostly at Bristol Castle, for 39 years, never charged with anything and never freed, until she died still a prisoner in 1241, the longest-held royal captive in English history. Her crime, in full, was her birth. Eleanor herself was spared the knowledge of most of that. After Mirabeau, her last battle won, she withdrew for good behind the walls of Fontevraud, and took the veil, a nun at the end after all, on her own terms and in her own time, in the abbey where her grandfather's wronged wife had hidden from Dangerous 80 years before, where her husband and Richard lay buried, and where dying Joan had been received into the order with her unborn child. The community she joined was unusual in all of Europe, a double monastery of monks and nuns ruled by its founder's decree by a woman, the abbess set over the men, and you can see why it suited her. Her health failed through the early months of 1204, and the political news racing toward her can only have hurried the end. Philip of France was swallowing Normandy castle by castle, and in early March the great fortress of Chateau Gaillard, Richard's masterpiece, the supposedly impregnable lock on the duchy, fell after a siege of horrors, a siege during which the garrison had expelled the useless mouths, hundreds of townsfolk, old people, women, children, and the French had refused to let them pass, so that the expelled starved through the winter in the ditch between the armies, eating grass and dogs and, the chronicler Guillaume Le Breton claims, worse, dying in sight of both sides while soldiers watched from the walls above them. That was the world going on outside as the old queen faded. Eleanor of Aquitaine died at Fontevraud on the 1st of April 1204, aged about 80, and within months Normandy was French, and the empire she had spent 50 years building and defending had effectively ceased to exist. The nuns who tended her wrote her obituary in the abbey's necrology, and their verdict from the women who actually knew her at the end sounds nothing like the chronicler's venom. She had brightened the world, they wrote, with the splendor of her royal offspring, had graced her noble birth with the honesty of her life, and by the fame of her matchless goodness had surpassed almost all the queens of the world. Their sentence sits in the record next to everything else, and she went into legend carrying all of it at once. Richard of Devizes, a monk writing while she governed England, called her an incomparable woman, beautiful yet virtuous, powerful yet gentle, humble yet keen-witted, tireless in every undertaking, whose ability was the marvel of her age, and then, in the same passage, glanced at the Antioch rumours with a wink you can see 800 years later, remarking that this same queen had been at Jerusalem in the time of her first husband, and let no one say any more about it. He knew the matter well. Be silent. William of Tyre made her an adulteress. Gerald of Wales made her the lover of her father-in-law and her family the seed of a demon. The ballads made her a poisoner in a labyrinth. The archbishop's letter made her an unnatural wife. Her own dictated words made her a mother with her guts torn out, raging at God's deputy on earth. Every one of those documents is real, and every one of them is describing the same woman. She had the last word on the question anyway, in stone. The tomb effigy she commissioned for herself at Fontevraud, carved and painted around the time of her death, shows her crowned in a nun's wimple, lying in state, and in her hands, held open before her face, a book. Sculptors of that era gave dead queens prayer-clasped hands. Somebody, and the somebody was almost certainly Eleanor, chose instead what may be the earliest tomb effigy in Europe of a person shown with an open book, an image of a woman occupied for eternity with words. Slandered by writers for 70 years, she elected to spend forever quietly turning pages above the bones of the men who defined her. Even the bones weren't the end of it. Fontevraud held its Plantagenet dead for 6 centuries, Henry and Eleanor side by side, Richard, Joan, and in time the heart of King John's widow. The family gathered in death as it never once managed to gather in life. Then came the French Revolution. In 1793, revolutionary forces sacked the abbey, and the royal tombs were broken open, and the remains of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and Eleanor of Aquitaine were pulled out and scattered, and no one recorded where. The bones of the woman who ruled 2 kingdoms are somewhere in the soil of the Loire Valley, unmarked, mixed with everyone else's. The painted effigies survived, barely, thrown aside, rediscovered in 1816 when someone finally went looking, and returned over the years to the Abbey Church, where they lie today over empty ground. The Abbey itself Napoleon converted into a prison in 1804, and a prison it remained until 1963, 150 years of cells and convicts in the halls where the nuns had sung over her body. A woman who spent 16 years locked up came to rest in a building that became a jail. She would have had something dry to say about that, one suspects, and being Eleanor, she would have said it in 3 languages and outlived the warden. And that's where I'll leave her, the Stone Queen with her open book above an empty grave. Thank you so much for spending this one with me. It was a long road and you stuck it out, and I appreciate every single one of you. If you enjoyed it, a like genuinely helps more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I've got some grim ones lined up. Enormous thanks to the patrons and YouTube members holding this whole operation together. You're the reason these keep coming. And if you fancy joining them, everything's linked in the description and the pinned comment. Tell me in the comments, was she ruthless or just the last one standing? Sleep well. See you in the next one.